Welcome to Safeguard Training, created by EDS. You will need a notepad and a pen, some concentration, and an environment where you can listen well. What does safeguarding actually mean? Safeguarding adults is defined by the Care Act 2014 as protecting a person's right to live in safety, free from abuse, and free from neglect. That maybe sounds obvious, but when we are carers providing support for people who are classed as vulnerable, living in their own homes, it's really important that we understand what safeguarding really means. So, who may class as a vulnerable adult? Somebody who's elderly, an individual who has a diagnosis of dementia, somebody living with learning disabilities, mental health issues, physical disabilities, sensory impairments, chronic illnesses, and obviously subject misuse. So that means that every client you provide care for classes as a vulnerable adult. We don't have anybody we support who doesn't class as a vulnerable adult, which means that our job is incredibly important and incredibly special because we are always doing our utmost to look after vulnerable people, which is a wonderful thing to be able to do. When we're talking about safeguarding and we're talking about risks to anybody and risks to vulnerable adults, we are talking about abuse. You'll have all have heard the term abuse. Now, there's different categories of abuse. There's physical, which obviously would constitute as hitting, slapping, biting, pinching, burning, hair pulling, anything physical to the body. Sexual, which is any sort of sexual attack on the person. So that could be physically with unwelcomed physical sexual attention. It could be verbal. It can be anything that makes somebody feel uncomfortable in that way. It could be discrimination against their own sexuality. Neglect is when somebody, one adult, fails to provide support, care, nutrition, hydration, clothing, medical attention for another. We have psychological, which classes as anything that makes somebody feel emotionally got at. So name calling, mocking, shouting, any bullying, anything that's intimidating, anything that's meant for one person to make the other feel horrible and vulnerable. Discriminatory. Now this goes both ways. So we don't discriminate against our clients. We provide care for anybody. What we sometimes experience, which is very sad that we still do, is discrimination towards some of us as staff members. That might be due to race, sexuality, age, gender, whatever it may be. It is something that we don't tolerate, and it's something that I like to point out in the safeguarding session, that just because you are a carer, you're the professional providing care for a vulnerable adult, doesn't mean you have to suffer discrimination. So if you are ever in a situation where you feel discriminated against by a client, a colleague, anybody in your professional capacity, even domiciliary service, please bring it to the attention of the direct management or your mentor, because it is not something we tolerate. It works both ways. Financial abuse. So this could be where there's theft of money, theft of property, over control over somebody's finances, and that is something that we often experience in generally. We have many clients who do have vulnerabilities in the way of mental capacity, so they have power of attorneys for the finances, so there's already somebody overseeing and controlling that money, that property, that decision all around the finance, and we need to make sure that we feel that's been done fairly, sensibly, and in that person's best interest. Domestic violence is something that I still like to remind people of, because it can take one or more forms. There are lots of things to domestic violence, unfortunately, and just because our clients are elderly doesn't mean they're exempt from those sort of situations. We can have clients who have lived for decades with domestic violence and it's become their norm. When we enter that environment, and if we recognise that, it absolutely needs to be flagged up, because that shouldn't be somebody's norm. It can be very difficult for us to determine when there is an issue and when there isn't. Again, we get lots of clients who've lived together for decades, and the way they communicate with each other is not how you would communicate with your partner, your parent, your friend, your child, but it is their norm. And there can be situations where that norm is acceptable, that there's actually no harm within that form of communication, that is just how they are, that's just how their environment is. But anything that sticks out of what would class as the normal setup, we do really encourage you to flag it up to the office, to the on-call, to somebody. Always say what you see. Self-neglect is a huge form of abuse, which gets really seriously overlooked because it's something that can be easily overlooked because people assume, well, she's choosing to do that to herself, so it's fine. It's not fine. It sometimes is something we have to accept that we can't do anything about, but again, it's something that we need to be mindful of, we need to be aware of, and if there is anything we can do about it, then we need to be doing something about it. So somebody could be self-neglecting their health, they could be not taking the medication, sustenance, they could be not eating well. They might not be able to avoid self-harm in way of their environment is unsafe. They don't take care of who they let into their property. They could be flaky with their finances and personal affairs and not bother to keep things up, not care sort of where things are going, who gets what when they walk through the door. They could be abusing substance. Again, these adults, these clients are on their own the vast majority of the time. To pass that time, people choose to do different things and they're not always sensible things to do. We do see quite a lot of substance abuse within our clients, either whether it's been there present historically or whether it's a new-ish thing, it is still an issue and it's still something we need to be aware of and take consideration over. Modern slavery I mentioned too because, again, sadly, it's not exempt from our clients, or certainly not people that are involved in our clients. The most popular thing in lots of the public domain recently has been so much focused on female genital mutilation because it's really, really common in some ethnic groups. Now, hopefully that's not something we ever come across, but again, it's something we mention because it's not an impossibility, sadly. Certainly when we're considering that when we're providing care for somebody, we are also expected to keep our eyes and ears and hearts open to the people involved with that client. So there might be children in the household where that might well be something we need to be aware of. There might be other caregivers, there might be other friends, family members. Human trafficking, which obviously is something which is so horrendous and so awful, and it falls often in line with forced labour. And there are many different forms of forced labour. When we think of human trafficking, it's usually associated with drug trafficking, human trafficking, so with a sexual intent or content to it. It can also be in the form of forced labour. So we work with lots of clients who may have living carers. Living carers often are brought in from different countries, different areas of the world, different communities, and again, we are partly responsible to make sure that situation's okay. There may be instances where somebody who is a living carer for a client is there against their will. The reason we mention this is it's been an experience between a very close company to EAM Domiciliary Service, and it was a horrendous experience for the other company. And it's a big responsibility when you actually notice something or somebody confides in you that something really is the matter. And the point that I'm making is that if anybody does bring anything to your table, please bring it to ours, share it with somebody in management confidentially so we can be supportive and we can try and help with that. Sexual exploitation as well classes within the modern slavery. There's all these new forms of abuse which are sort of being labelled and being put out there, and it's just everything needs to be on our radar when we're providing care for vulnerable adults. Absolutely everything. So when I'm talking about us providing care for vulnerable adults and we're talking about all these big, scary, heavy things, what is our duty of care as carers? So as a carer, you're a healthcare professional. Your role is to support our clients to live a life that is free from any harm and any abuse. And it's fundamental because it's a human right and it's essential for health and well-being. It sounds very basic and it should be something we are all granted without any question, hesitation or compromise. but it doesn't always work like that. As a carer, what we expect you to be is alert, to be aware of your client's needs and the role in which you're supporting them. Work within any care plans, any tasks that are on your Roadrunner, make sure you're following them. Speak up if you feel that current care could be delivered in a different way, or if we're missing something that's missing out on one of these people's needs. We need to provide care in a way that promotes and protects dignity and privacy. And if you ever suspect that any abuse is taking place, it really is your responsibility, your personal responsibility, to report it. Remember, you have that duty of care to your clients. If you witness abuse taking place, it is again your responsibility to report it. If you feel unsure about a situation, you must speak to somebody. I'm a really firm believer that there's a lot to be said for your gut instinct. And if ever you get a wobble in that way, communicate it, talk it out with somebody in management, and let us worry about if there's actually a situation that we need to be heavily concerned about. You also have a duty of care to yourself. So please always remember to not put yourself in any compromised situations. If you are ever in a situation where a client is being inappropriate towards you, whether that be in sexual comment, discriminatory comment, generally aggressive, anything that doesn't make you feel comfortable, bring it for discussion. Please always talk about it to a member of the management. And if any situation directly poses you harm, remove yourself from it. Don't stay in that situation. Remove yourself and let somebody know that you've had to do that. Jumping back to our responsibility to the environment the client is in, that includes children. In a very basic aspect of when we're providing care for a vulnerable adult, we are accountable for the care that a child within that household may or may not be receiving. Now, we're not providing care for those children, but we are providing care within that environment. So what it means to safeguard children in the same home is basically a child has to be free to be a child. And when there's vulnerable adults in a household and children, it can create a very challenging situation. Same types of abuse obviously apply to children as well as adults. They are all the same. Children have their own separate needs that need to be met as well. So we might be there providing care for their adult or an associated adult, but what you need to keep your eye out for is that child having their own needs met, or are those child's needs being compromised in the way they're having to meet the vulnerable adult's needs? Again, there has been an experience in the past where there was sadly issue with the quality of care a child in a household was receiving by the caregiver. It wasn't intentional, but it was definitely present, and that was due to the sizable needs of the adult that we're providing care for. And it became our responsibility to flag up those concerns, and it had a positive outcome. It wasn't an easy thing to do, and the carers involved were absolutely fantastic and did all of the right things, but it is very, very important to always say what you see. As I say, those children should be free to live as children. They don't want access to medication. That would be unsafe, that would be unreasonable, irresponsible. There needs to be toys. They need to be free to play. They shouldn't be doing tasks that aren't child friendly. For example, doing the cleaning, doing the shopping. There should not be inappropriate content available to the children in way of visual material, reading material. The environment needs to be appropriate for the child. Language being used in that environment. So there might be instances where, again, it could be somebody's normal situation, how they communicate between each other. But if there's children in that environment, it needs to be appropriate for that child. When we're talking about common indicators, when we're looking for physical abuse, sexual abuse, things that we can actually see, experience has actually happened, we're looking for things that are in unusual places, in places that are hard to explain how the bruises or the damage has got there. And if these bruises are repeating themselves, so we've got repetition in pattern of bruising, where would be unusual to have a bruise is somewhere where it would be hard to get to. If you think about the inside of your own thighs, it's actually quite hard to get a bruise there. If you think in the inside of the tops of your arms, it's quite hard to get a bruise there. The top of your ear, under your eye, You're talking about things that really, areas that really are got to with intent. We're not talking about bumping knees, bumping elbows. There's obvious things like burn marks show when there's a burn mark. Again, it's obvious if something's happened by accident. Where it is, the position of it, repetition of it will show if it's been done with intent. So we're looking at unusual bruising, unusual burn marks, repetition in areas where there'd be concern. Restraint classes as physical abuse. So if you ever come across a client who has clearly been or being restrained, that absolutely needs flagging up. That classes as physical abuse. Overuse of medication as well. That's something we need to be very wary of with our clients, because sadly, again, that's something that has been experienced in the history of EAM domiciliary service. Family members think they are doing the right thing by giving relatives more medication than they are prescribed because they feel it will help. It's not the right thing to do. If we feel like somebody needs further assessment with medication, that needs to be done professionally. It cannot just be done by choice. Change of behaviour. Now that is a big thing, a big warning sign. Now an example would be a child who becomes fearful when they stood with a grown man. The reality of it is that actually the child's just having trouble at school. There's no issue with the grown man. That's not the concern. So you could then interpret that in one way or the other, but it is always worth flagging it up because it has an innocent conclusion in this scenario, but it may not have done in another. You might have a relative who is saying that their mother, father, whoever is becoming more and more confused and they need to be in a home, and they're making this assessment themselves. They are making sure that they are already locked in their own home or their own room so they're not causing trouble, risk to themselves, risk to others, etc., etc. There could be that misuse of medication. It's our responsibility to flag that up to professional people, our management team included, so we can really investigate that and see if there's something to that or if there's nothing to it. Which brings me to whistleblowing. So it's possibly a term that you've heard before, it's possibly a term you've never heard before. What it means is when we report abuse, we are protected as the reporters of that suspected or witnessed abuse. You're protected by law to do that because it's in the benefit of the individual you're discussing. Whistleblowing is something where you are, again, totally covered by law to what they call blow the whistle. And that is when you have to raise a concern about an agency, a manager, an environment where really you should be heard. So, for example, in the EAM domiciliary case scenario, it might be we're worried about a client and their safety at home, and we raise that to the Derbyshire County Council, our local authority, because that is who contracts their care. Then if we don't get any response from the council, or they're not interested, or they're not going to do anything about this concern, and we really feel this concern needs responding to, but our natural place we go to report it doesn't respond to us, we can go above that council and we can then actually report the council for wrongdoing, or because they've not responded to what we feel is a great concern. That would be a good example of whistleblowing. We are going above the person who we should naturally, professionally be able to go to, and we're protected by that. It's done confidentially and it's done in a safe way to ensure that that person that we are concerned about gets that concern recognised and gets that potential care that they possibly need. We are protected entirely by law. Now, we have a duty of candour. It's within your care certificate. So when you qualify as a carer, you have a care certificate, and within that you work under 15 care standards. One of them is duty of candour, which basically means honesty. It's talking about your integrity. And what we want to make sure is that you are always being honest, that you've always got that opportunity to bring some information forward to somebody, and we can see what we can do with that information as and when we have it. We do our best to always do the safest things we can as a company, and one example of that is safe recruitment. We take DBS checks, as you'll all be aware of, you'll have needed one yourself. We get references, we check employment history, and we try and ensure that we are always employing people as safely as possible. Having said that, if you ever notice something within a colleague that you're not happy with, you need to report it to us. There might be something that we miss. People that are intent on doing harm are very good at doing that harm without being noticed of doing it. My point to you isn't run out and suspect everybody of being evil. My point is be wary of everybody when you're in a situation where you're dealing with vulnerable adults. So that includes your colleagues as well as other professionals that are involved in their care, family members, friends, neighbours, etc. It is a big area when you're talking about safeguarding, because we have a mental capacity of clients to consider as well. We have to make sure that what people are saying, what your clients are saying, are actually accurate and they're not false. Again, people with dementia experience things differently. They remember, they recollect things differently, they see things differently. It doesn't mean that we dismiss them just because that person has dementia. The point about including mental capacity here is that, again, anything that is raised to you, whether you feel it's sound or unsound, don't let that be your decision. Bring it to the management and let us decide whether we have something we need to worry about or not. We as a company are governed by the CQC, which is the Care Quality Commission. We're regulated by them and our local authority. So we're constantly being checked that we are doing the right things as a company. What we really need you to do is always be doing the right things as carers, as staff members, to promote us to do the right things as well. So to recap, always ask if you're unsure or you recognise anything that makes you feel uneasy. Always report anything that could be in the client's best interest. Even if it feels awkward or uncomfortable for you to communicate that, it's more important that you do. Always report any wrongdoings. Even if you've done that yourself, you might have done something by accident, you might have given too much medication, you might have done the wrong thing. It's totally fine if you let us know that you've done that. That shows that you didn't do it with any malicious intent. And remember, we're here to support you, to support our clients. So if there's anything you feel we need in addition to be doing or that we're missing, please let us know. And that obviously extends to yourselves as well. We want you to be safe and happy when you're out at work, so our clients can be. Please always talk to us if you have any concerns about anybody's health or well-being. Always, including your own.